Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to today's Humanities in Action program. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you to, well, our houses, such as the COVID world, but we have really wonderful guests joining us today. A few things I want to make. My name is Max Orr. I'm the Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities, and we're going to be bringing in our speaker. Well, here they are. Hello, our speakers. Joining us from, well, perhaps right in front of Polk Plaza, or we don't know exactly what that is, but it's the magic of virtual reality here, folks. Before we begin, before I introduce our speakers, I want to just have a few things I need to cover here, including thanking our sponsors, the Cotton Merca Group and Morgan Stanley, who are always so generous in supporting especially our K-12 programs. We also want to thank Carolina Meadows, a retirement community at Chapel Hill, who support both our public programming and our K-12 programmings, and our great partner, the General Alumni Association, who has a partner in publicizing and promoting our works, and especially this series, the Humanities in Action series. Of course, I'd be remiss without thanking our wonderful staff at Carolina Public Humanities, including Paul Bonici, who picked out some fantastic music there. Mavis Staples, you can't go wrong with the Staples singers. Thank you. So Paul does wonderful work behind the scenes in all of our virtual programming, so we can't thank Paul enough. I also want to thank Brian Ensminger for registering all of you so you can get here, and Vicki Breeden, who is monitoring everything from the mothership back at Carolina Public Humanities offices. If you don't know who we are or what we do, we're Carolina Public Humanities. We're the dedicated outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's our job to make sure that great faculty and scholarship from Carolina are shared with communities throughout the state. And of course, we do that through public programs like this, normally, which happen not like this, as you know, but often at Flyleaf Books. We have our Adventures and Ideas weekend seminars, great book groups. When we can attend the movies, we used to have something called Cinema School. All of this is coming in the future, we can only hope. But we also have two other prongs of our organization that you should be aware of, our community college outreach. So we are bringing faculty and scholarship all throughout North Carolina, and partnering up with community colleges in the mountains, on the coast, on the plains, wherever we can, and again, reaching those wonderful communities and audiences there. And of course, our subsidiary, Carolina K-12. Which is our way of making sure that the public school teachers and teachers throughout the state of North Carolina have access to some really important work that is being done in North Carolina to help them teach these difficult subjects like race, history, economic inequality, and whatnot, that those can be shared in a sensitive and important and informed way. So those Carolina Public Humanities is more than what you're seeing right now. If this is your first time joining us. And I just want to say one other thing, folks. If you'd like to support us in our mission, especially in our missions with community colleges and with K-12 organizations, please feel free to give to Carolina Public Humanities. All donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. That's what we are. We have some upcoming programs I quickly want to tell you about. Our Adventures and Ideas weekend seminars start next week with February 11th and 12th with Escape, Imaginary Lands and Magical Reality. You might guess how we were inspired to think about that as we're all stuck in our homes. Gerhard Weinberg will be joining us on February 20th with World War II in the Pacific. And in early March, we have the Global Challenge of Religious Freedom on March 5th and 6th. We have other Adventures and Ideas seminars. Please go to humanities.unc.edu for the full listing of those. And of course, this Humanities in Action series will be continuing throughout February and March. We skipped next week, but we'll be doing healthcare with the great John Oberlander on February 17th. And finally, I want to remind folks that next week we kick off a really fun series we've started called Lunch with Friends and Strangers. And this is our opportunity to have faculty come, those are the friends, and bring somebody important that we might know or might need to know better or don't know. That's the stranger. So it's a biography program on Fridays at 12. It starts next Friday, February 12th, with Hassan Malehi coming to talk about Jack Kerouac. So line up, sign up, get involved, folks. We'd love to see you at any one of these programs. And now let's get to what we're doing today. We have a really important program today on the fragility of democracy and looking at race and voting rights in North Carolina. And we're joined by two good friends of Carolina Public Humanities, Dr. Jim Leloudis and Dr. Robert Korstad, Jim and Bob, as they told me I could refer to them too. And What's really wonderful about it, both you will have their bios here in the chat, so you don't have to have me read their CVs. But just a few things: they're both received their PhDs from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Dr. Korstad went and did all of his work in his career. He's now emeritus professor at Duke University, and of course, Jim Leloudis has continued here at UNC, where he not only is a professor of history, but is also runs our really wonderful honors program. What is great, of course, is the interinstitutional link up between these two, but I think it's also a matter of deep friendship and deep shared interest in these topics. They have written many works together, including To Right These Wrongs, the North Carolina Fund, and the Battle to End Poverty and Injustice in 1960s America, which we had a wonderful public program on, which probably seems like a millennia ago. And they've continued to do great work, especially with their Carolina K-12 constituencies. Like I said, I want to make sure that you can read about them in their bios here in the chat. And that's all I'm going to say about them. But just to say, it's so great to see good friends coming and joining us and talking about an important topic. So I'm going to turn off my camera now and turn the show over to our esteemed colleagues. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be here. Bob and I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to everyone who's joined the webinar for giving us the gift of your afternoon. So we want to talk a little bit about the book, and we'll tag team it a bit here. I think the place to start is by sort of acknowledging that this is a book about the past that very much has its origins in the concerns of the present day. Fragile Democracy is based on work that the two of us have done as expert witnesses in a number of court cases involving voting rights in North Carolina. The first was centered on House Bill 589. You probably remember back in 2013, that sweeping omnibus bill that reformed election and law in North Carolina. For the first time, it stood to impose a voter photo ID requirement. It shortened early voting, did away with out of precinct voting, same-day registration, teen early registration, and so on. That legislation, you may also remember, was struck down in 2016 by the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which ruled in a memorable phrase that it targeted minority voters, to quote the court, in the words, with near surgical precision. And the next two cases are currently pending, one in state court and the other in federal court. Both involve Senate Bill 824, the recent legislation that would implement the voter photo ID requirement that's part of the 2018 amendment to North Carolina's Constitution. And so, as historians and as participants in these contests over voting rights, we can't help but share another observer's sense, to quote him, that the politics of today are very much continuous with the past. And that's certainly true for the struggle over voting rights in North Carolina. I mean, the struggle that we're in the midst of now is not unique, but it is instead the latest episode in a long contest that stretches all the way back to the end of the Civil War and the death of slavery. So that's why we've used history to try to kind of frame and contextualize the current debate. And we wrote Fragile Democracy to share with a broad public audience in North Carolina what we discovered in the course of our research. One of the book's central arguments, and actually I should say really the book's central argument, is that in North Carolina, the battle over voting rights has played out in repeating episodes of what Bob and I have described as emancipatory politics on the one hand, expansion of access to the franchise, answered in every instance by backlash and conservative retrenchment. in a pattern that's been repeated, as I said, over and over again since emancipation. Black North Carolinians and their white progressive allies have formed political movements to end racial injustice, to open up access to the ballot box, to lay claim to the rights of equal citizenship. And they've done that, I think it's really important to underscore here, done that not only to advance their own interest, but also to promote participatory democracy more generally, and to make government more responsive to the needs of all its people. So the first of these episodes occurred in the era that we describe as the long era of Reconstruction, which ran from emancipation in 1865, or actually 1863, the beginning of emancipation, to the white supremacy movements in North Carolina in 1898 and 1900, which is, again, I'm sure you know, established what would follow the regime of Jim Crow and racial segregation. So this long era of Reconstruction, it's framed on one end by the North Carolina Constitution of 1868. And if you've never read that document, and I suspect few, if any of you have ever gone and looked it up, but you should, because it is really a remarkable document. When my students have a look at it, they're sort of surprised that such a document would have been crafted in 1868. It was written, it was drafted by representatives of a progressive biracial coalition that had formed primarily in 1867, early 1868, within North Carolina's newly organized Republican Party. And as I say, it's a remarkable document. It established for the first time in this state universal male suffrage, the right of every adult male citizen to vote. It removed property restrictions for candidates for high elective office in the state. It guaranteed, and this is one of the really interesting things about this Constitution that makes it quite different from most state constitutions. And this provision is turning out to be really important, particularly in state court. North Carolina's Constitution of 1868 guarantees every voter the right to cast a ballot in a free and fair election, and specifies that in language that you won't find, for example, in the US Constitution. And I think particularly relevant to some of the folks in the webinar this afternoon, this Constitution in 1868 included the first mandate in North Carolina for a statewide system of free public schools. So when I'm teaching a course on North Carolina in this period, I often ask my students to raise their hands if they were educated in public schools in North Carolina. And of course, the vast majority of the hands go up in the air. And I remind them that they, in a very direct way, owe that opportunity, particularly to people newly emancipated from slavery, who wrote that provision into the North Carolina Constitution in 1868. So what's at play here, as we step back from all of this and kind of take the measure of it, is a radically inclusive vision of American democracy and of the role of government in advancing human flourishing. Now, white elites who called themselves conservatives with a capital C, that would later call themselves Democrats, they opposed that vision and they sought to destroy it. They did so through violence, and they also did so by erecting barriers around the ballot box. And if the technology cooperates here, I'm going to switch quickly to a screen share and just show you a few images. So as you think about this history, be reminded of the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and the ways that it used intimidation and political assassination to suppress the Black vote and that of progressive whites. This is a kind of chilling drawing from Harper's Weekly in 1872. It's titled "The Visit of the Klan." Or you can jump forward to the virulent white supremacy campaigns carried out in North Carolina by the state Democratic Party between 1908 and 1900. In that campaign, white supremacists stoked fears, as you see here, of what they called Negro domination. This quite extraordinary front page cartoon from the News and Observer, which was really the major mouthpiece for the Democratic Party for these white supremacy campaigns in 1898 and 1900. Negro rule springing up the black incubus from the ballot box. A really menacing image. They also organized squads of vigilantes that were known as red shirts. Think of it as a kind of latter-day version of the Klan. The red shirt title it refers to the color of their uniforms, and you see that where this picture not in black and white. And it's a symbol. It's a reference to the bloody shirt of Confederate sacrifice in the Civil War. This is a picture of red shirts in Laurinburg on election day. And if you look closely look at the front row, the fourth figure from the right, you'll see that he and the others too, but have come armed. You'll see the handgun that he's holding there. They've come to harass voters at the polls. And in a story I think now is familiar to most North Carolinians, in this white supremacy campaign, leaders in Wilmington staged the only municipal coup d'etat in American history. A murderous coup that drove the city's biracial government from office. As you look a little bit at this image, maybe some of you will be able to take an educated guess as to what it is. It's a souvenir postcard produced by Wilmington photographers. So imagine that you had been in this crowd. This was your opportunity to buy a dozen or so of these postcards and send them to your friends. It's kind of witness to your participation in that coup. And all of this, of course, set the stage in 1900 for an amendment to the state constitution. An amendment to the Constitution that aimed to end the prospect for biracial politics, the kind we saw in Reconstruction or the period right after the war, the kind we're seeing here again at the end of this long era of Reconstruction. This amendment aimed to end the prospect for biracial politics once and for all, and to do that by disenfranchising, by taking the vote away from Black men and a significant number of whites as well. The amendment, which by the way is still in North Carolina's Constitution, though invalidated by the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and subsequent lawsuits. But this amendment sought to disenfranchise Black men through a literacy test, requiring them to demonstrate their literacy as a condition of being afforded the right to vote. And it's worth stopping and thinking about this for a moment. I was actually spent about 5 hours yesterday in a deposition in preparation for the court hearing of one of the state lawsuit. We talked a lot about this. The literacy test on its face was a non-racial test. It wasn't There's nothing in it that said it was race specific. But in practice, in its implementation, it put the burden on Black electors. And it did that largely because it gave local registrars broad discretionary authority in the way they tested literacy and what they considered to be a passing performance. So try this. Again, something I would do in class. And this here this afternoon, this is an erudite group, so I'm sure this should be a really simple test. If you pull out a piece of paper and a pencil, and would you write out for me Article 3 of the US Constitution? All right, so everyone's written it out, and I'm sure everyone knows what Article 3 does. It establishes the judiciary. If even one of you got it, you did better than my students. And I always take a kind of little bit of joy in letting them know that they obviously are not qualified to vote. Well, Black disenfranchisement was the keystone in that regime of racial separation and subjugation that came to be known as Jim Crow. And here's what's important to understand about Jim Crow. Yes, it was an expression of white racism. Yes, it was a regime of racial segregation, but it was also more than that. In the broadest and most fundamental sense, Jim Crow was a system of power and plunder. A system of power and plunder that concentrated wealth and political authority in the hands of the few. System of power and plunder that privileged private interests over the common good. Now, how did it do that? Well, it did that by, first of all, driving Black earnings down to near subsistence levels. That in turn devalued all labor, white as well as Black. And Jim Crow protected that power and that plunder by persuading ordinary whites not to lift their voices in protest, lest they lose what W.B. Du Bois described as the psychological wages of whiteness. Right? That promise that no matter how far they might fall, there would always be someone beneath them. That someone beneath them would be Black. So if you want to understand why it is that North Carolina and so much of the rest of the South, why the state through so much of its history was desperately poor, why so many North Carolinians were ill-fed, ill-clad, ill-clothed, ill-housed, if you want to understand that, here's the explanation. You have to turn to an understanding of this regime of Jim Crow. Well, conservatives were euphoric in 1900 when Charles Brantley Aycock was elected governor and the Disenfranchisement Amendment was ratified. Here are a couple of souvenirs from 2 years earlier, the first white supremacy campaign in 1898. And again, some of you with sharp eyes may have noticed that the figure there on that badge, that's Julian Carr. Of course, has been much in the news in recent years with relation to the Confederate monument at UNC. So conservatives were euphoric in 1900, and many of them believed that they had, to quote one participant, that they had solved what he called the Negro problem for all time. But as one other astute white observer noted, in fact, every generation would have to sort out for itself these underlying questions of race and democracy. And that's because even in the depths of Jim Crow segregation, Black North Carolinians refused to surrender their claim on equal citizenship, their claim to a fair share of social resources and economic opportunity. And again, this is really important because I think there is kind of an inclination often, and certainly used to be true in the historical literature, that when you got to the era of Jim Crow, well, this was about segregation and subjugation. What else was there to say? But in fact, there's much more to say because Black North Carolinians did not surrender those claims. And the examples abound, many of them missing from history books and certainly missing from general public memory of North Carolina's past. I mean, consider, for instance, the story of Lewis Austin, editor of the Carolina Times, who in the 1930s encouraged the very small number of Blacks who managed to register to vote, encouraged them to affiliate with the Democratic Party, to abandon the party of Lincoln, and to register as Democrats, in a sense, to take the struggle to the very belly of the beast and to take the struggle to the party that controlled political power in North Carolina and the rest of the South. Similarly, how many of us know the story of the more than 20,000 Black tobacco workers in Winston-Salem and the market towns of Eastern North Carolina? Bob has written about their story. These Black tobacco workers who in the 1940s formed a union to win better wages and working conditions, and who supported the election of local Black officials who were some of the first in the Jim Crow South to defeat white opponents. One of them was the man here second from the left. This is G.K. Butterfield Sr. Of course, his son now represents North Carolina in Congress. But here he is taking the oath of office after winning election to Wilson's, as one of those tobacco towns in the East, to the town commission in Wilson. Or do you know the story of James Walker, one of the first Black graduates of UNC's law school, who in the 1950s moved home to Eastern North Carolina and began to do pioneering work and in sort of historical memory, largely unacknowledged work, kind of pioneering work that laid the foundation for the voting rights movement in Eastern North Carolina in the 1960s. At every turn, these advocates of equal citizenship met stiff and remarkably inventive resistance from white elites. I'll give you an example using this image here. When Black candidates like G.K. Butterfield Sr. began, and remember the numbers are tiny, but when they began in the late 40s, early 50s to win elected office down at the local level, the state legislature acted to block their path by reorganizing county government and municipal governments, not statewide, but particularly in the heavily Black counties of Eastern North Carolina. And what they did is they moved away from ward-based systems of representation, where candidates were elected to represent a particular geographic region within a town or within a county, moved away from that ward-based system of representation to at-large schemes of representation that, if you think about it, made it almost mathematically impossible for a Black candidate to win. We've all voted in these kinds of elections today, right? When you go to the ballot box and the ballot, for say for county commissioner or another set of offices, might show a list of 5 candidates and it says vote for 3. Well, if you think through the math of that, unless large numbers of the majority of the population vote for the minority candidate, the minority candidate's got almost no chance mathematically. The one way that Black voters could counter the effect of at-large elections was to cast what were called single-shot ballots. And that is to take that ballot that said, here are 5, vote for 3. They would vote for 1 and no others. In effect, not throw away those other votes to help opponents win. Well, when Black voters started to do that, the state legislature outlawed single shot voting in the counties marked in gray here. So this is from the early 1950s into the early 60s is what you see represented on this map. As one veteran of the struggle observed, the lesson was always the same. You beat the white man at one trick and he'll try another. Well, let me end the screen share and also surrender the screen and the microphone to Bob.
So thanks, Jim. So I hope these historical examples and episodes provide a useful framework for helping us understand the debate over voting rights in our own time. And in fact, I think we can see familiar patterns in these contests. The more modern story, really begins with the Civil Rights Movement, and more particularly the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided tools for finally enforcing the 15th and 19th Amendments to the Constitution. Now, change didn't come all at once, but over the course of a couple decades, a series of court rulings, along with ongoing grassroots organizing, particularly in Eastern North Carolina, pried open the door to increase Black political participation. And by 1989, there were 19 Black lawmakers in the state legislature, and more than 400 office holders served at the county or municipal level statewide. Such numbers had not been seen really since the end of the 19th century, when before the time of disenfranchisement. Now, these gains in Black political influence provided an essential ingredient for a new multiracial progressive alliance, and that in the 1990s and 2000s reimagined the role of state government in providing economic opportunity and security for all North Carolinians. During these decades, lawmakers increased spending on public education. They raised teacher salaries to the national average. They established Smart Start, which poured millions of dollars into early childhood education. They created Health Choice, a program for uninsured children. And to secure all of these achievements, lawmakers also eased and enlarged access to the voting box. Key legislation permitted early voting, as we talked about earlier. It allowed voters who went to the wrong precinct to cast a provisional ballot, permitted same-day registration, created a system where students who were 17, 18-year-old could get their names placed on the voting rolls so they could vote when they turned 18. And the net effect of these electoral law reforms was a major increase in Black political participation that was sufficient to deliver a razor-thin majority for President Barack Obama in 2008. Now, like the earlier times, there was a conservative reaction that followed these changes that took a pretty predictable form. In 2010, conservatives now marching beneath the Republican banner won control of the state legislature. They did so in a campaign filled with dog whistles, to which white supremacists a century earlier would have called Negro domination. And 3 years later, this conservative majority, acting just weeks after the Supreme Court effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act, passed the most comprehensive reform of election law in the nation. And that bill, of course, was House Bill 589. And it wiped out all of these progressive reforms that I talked about earlier for voting procedures that made it easier for people to get to the polls and vote. And for good measure, the General Assembly added a requirement for voter photo ID for the first time. And as Jim said earlier, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals eventually overturned 589, virtually every aspect of it. They did so on the basis of clear evidence that they called because of race. North Carolina lawmakers had imposed strict new limitations on the right to vote. But let's linger and think about that for a minute in the context of this longer history that we've been talking about. Because of race. And what I'd suggest is that's only half right. House Bill 589 clearly bore the mark of racial animus. But Republicans didn't seek to disenfranchise Black and Latinx voters simply because of their skin color. As in the past, the suppression of minority vote was central to a much broader conservative agenda that's rooted in a markedly narrow conceptions of our obligations to one another as citizens and of the balance between private interests, and the welfare of the whole. The lawmakers who restricted voting rights also rejected federal funds to expand Medicaid from over 400,000 North Carolinians who were uninsured. Repealed the Racial Justice Act, which gave prisoners on death row the right to have their sentences commuted to life if they could show racial bias had affected either their trial or their conviction. It eliminated the state's earned income tax credit, which economists across the political spectrum agree is one of the most effective tools for raising people out of poverty. It cut spending on public education and made the state's unemployment benefits some of the stingiest in the nation.
And the point we underscore here is that few, if any, of these policies were likely to survive a free and fair election. And, on that count, the historical lesson was clear. And that's why conservative lawmakers didn't give up the fight after the Fourth Circuit threw out House Bill 589. Instead, they regrouped, they narrowed their focus. I mean, part of what had created trouble for House Bill 589 was that it was so comprehensive. It was kind of easy for the court just on those grounds to worry from the outset about that law. So after House Bill 589 is thrown out, the Republican majority in the legislature regrouped, narrowed their focus, and proposed in 2018 an amendment to the state constitution that requires a voter photo ID, ostensibly, or they argue, against supposedly widespread voter fraud. And it's worth also pausing here for a minute just to think about, again, the creativity and the inventiveness of shifting to a constitutional amendment. It offers a couple of advantages, right? It creates a situation in which the legislature subsequently has no choice under the Constitution but to pass a voter ID law. And it allows the architects of that amendment to say, well, this law that we just passed, it's not a partisan measure, it's the will of the people. It creates a kind of insulation around something like the voter photo ID implementation law, Senate Bill 824. Now, some observers have described the amendment and the law that followed, have described it as a solution in search of a problem. And they deserve some points for a clever turn of phrase. But again, I think a little bit like that phrase that Bob emphasized earlier, because of race. This notion that Senate Bill 824 is a solution in search of a problem, we'd suggest obscures more than it reveals. The fact of the matter is that today's legislative majority are trying to solve a problem. And it's a problem that's vexed conservatives, regardless of political party. Vexed conservatives for generations. And again, just as an aside here, when I say regardless of political party, it's really important, we can talk more about this later on, is to understand the way that party labels have flipped in this long history we're talking about. A lot of times people, and we've certainly encountered this in court, want to frame this as simply a partisan measure. And they'll just, Republicans against Democrats, Democrats against Republicans. The problem with that is that those party labels have changed. There's something more here than just intense partisan competition. So trying to solve a problem that, as I said, has vexed conservatives for generations, and that's an understanding, the ramifications of expanded minority political participation throughout North Carolina's history. When minority citizens have built alliances with progressive whites, and when they have gained access to the ballot box, they've cast their votes to advance an enduring agenda for equal justice, civil rights, democratic governance, and in all the ways that Bob described, more generous social provision, greater public investment in human flourishing, education, healthcare, housing, and we could go on with the list. Now, we published this book in September, right before the election. And when Bob and I were doing these sorts of talks in September and October, we were looking forward to the election and underscoring for people how important we thought this history is, in that context. We were talking about this earlier today. I think today we have to underscore how much more important it is in the aftermath of the election. As we try to find our way through the backwash of a long and concerted effort to spread the notion that there is widespread fraud, when clearly there is no evidence to support that charge. And in the process, to delegitimize American democracy itself. This is an overused phrase, but I think you really could call this a kind of existential crisis for American democracy. We face a choice that has been brought into particularly sharp focus by the events in Washington on January the 6th. And that is whether we will embrace the democratic goals with a little d of the people that Bob and I have been talking about this afternoon, whether we'll embrace and see that it's enforced, that guarantee of every North Carolinian to cast a ballot in a free and fair election, or whether we will satisfy ourselves with continuing to live in the shadow of Jim Crow, with its heritage of voter suppression, with its heritage of the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the few. this really is a time of choosing. And that question, the answer is very much up to us. Well, Max, why don't we stop there, and we are happy to entertain questions you may have and that folks in the audience may have.
I have a few questions for you. I want to thank you both for this, not just for your presentation today, but for your commitment to exposing this important history, and for also, using this for important reasons. That here you're testifying in court cases and whatnot. This is a real example that the humanities are not just ideas that just float out in libraries. They're very important for public policy. And so thank you both for your work and for your wonderful presentation. I find it both depressing and inspiring in some ways. And I just wanted to pick up on one thing before. I want to remind everybody that we do have this Q&A button down at the bottom here, and I'm going to wait for a few more questions to come in before I go to those. But I have a question myself, or a few questions. And one of the things that really struck out at me, Jim, was when you used the word plunder for white supremacy. It makes me think about the economic core of white supremacy. And it made me think about reparations and the difficulties of topics around that. The question I have is, how much is the focus in sort of American history, in a normative American history, where we look at the visible discrimination, we think in terms of voting rights, we look at segregated facilities, and we think about those things being fixed. How much does that occlude this economic aspect of white supremacy? And how important is it that aspect of white supremacy be have a light shown on it, and and what might be the impact on reparations? Can you speak a little bit about how it is that the economic aspect of white supremacy just kind of always a little whisper?
How much time do we have? I know Bob's going to want to speak to this too because of his work on tobacco workers in Winston-Salem. But I mean, let me take it just a kind of first general pass. I mean, I think you put your finger on kind of the impoverishment of our historical memory and the ways we suffer from that. When most Americans think of the civil rights movement, when they think of Martin Luther King, they think of the March on Washington, without remembering the full title. It was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And people tend to think of King's speech, right, and the dream that one day in the Red Hills of Georgia, my child and your child will, live together without thought of one another's skin color. Well, that was part of the dream, but I think especially for most white Americans, that's kind of where the dream stops. And so the idea is that, well, we got rid of segregation, the work is done. And we forget where King died, what he was in Memphis to do to support sanitation workers. And we we forget also King's remarkable Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967, in which he addresses, in both of those instances, this economic story you're talking about, and understanding that the work of the civil rights movement was not just the work of desegregating lunch counters, but it was the work of economic justice. And that's still an unfinished work. Reparations, we could talk about that a long time. Again, I'll just say one thing and then stop here. But what strikes me is in this country, we've never had this conversation. I mean, what happens is as soon as you mention the word, people say, "Oh, well, that's impossible. I can't imagine how we'd pay for it." Well, whatever it is may be impossible, but wouldn't it behoove us to have the conversation before answering the question?
Bob, would you like to contribute?
Well, I mean, I'll just say a couple things, but I think this also goes back really to the founding, colonization, the founding of this country, and makes us remember that slavery wasn't about a system of subordinating African Americans, or it was about raising cotton and making profit and creating wealth for whites. And I think there's a way in which, the whole system of Jim Crow, the regime of Jim Crow that Jim talked about, was as much about creating an economic environment, with low wages, limited regulation, very limited participation of working class people, white or black, the use of the courts to suppress unionization efforts, again, as much against white people as against black people. And trying to understand how politics and economics, how power and plunder go together throughout our state's history, I think is really important to think about, where we're going in the future. These are still, vital concerns in this state. Workplace safety, ability, of people to organize unions if they like, being able to work for a wage that's a living wage and not a poverty wage. So I think in looking at all these issues that we're writing about, the two are very, very much joined and have to be understood together.
I'm just reminded there of a line from a great historian of the South, C. Van't Woodward, that the struggle for white supremacy, was also the struggle over which whites would rule supreme.
Right.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting here. We have this white supremacy, the history of white supremacy. Of course, it has local stories, statewide stories, a regional story about the American South, and of course, a national story in that, they different levels at which this is all part of the piece of our history. I'm just curious about, how much is North Carolina's history giving us insights? And if we were to do this to Mississippi, would it be different? If we were to do this to other states, what is it about North Carolina's history that might give us better insights if that's the case? Or is it just all the same and we need to do this on a state level and a national level everywhere we can? Is there something particular about North Carolina?
Well, so kind of two answers to that. The general one is that in the broad outlines, the story looks familiar across the region. I think what we'd emphasize about North Carolina, and maybe this is a point for folks who are looking for hope, is that if there was a real chance of successful biracial politics in the late 19th century, it was here. Mm-hmm. In the years immediately after the Civil War, a larger percentage of whites than in any other Southern state crossed the race line into the Republican Party and made alliance with former slaves. Now, that didn't mean, immediately we had arrived at racial nirvana and those white folks had gotten, all the sort of god-awful notions out of their heads. But the possibility was there. And then again in the 1890s, in what was known as the fusion movement, it was an alliance of white populists who had bolted from the Democratic Party, mostly farming folk, and black Republicans. They won control of the state legislature and the governor's office. So there were fusion movements elsewhere in the South, but only in North Carolina did that kind of alliance win control of state government pretty much across the board, not the judicial branch, but the executive and the legislative. So there is, I think, a message of hope here, and in some ways, the last place people would look for it, right? In the story we've been telling of that kind of lost possibility in the late 19th century, and understanding that can help us. I think it can enlarge our imaginations about how we might go about creating the more democratic future I think most of us want to inhabit.
Great, thank you for that, Jim. Bob?
Yeah, I think the other issue, something that makes North Carolina stand out a little bit, although I think you can find similar stories in other parts of the state and other parts of the country, is just the kind of determination to resist this system, the kind of rebelliousness, the organization, the protest that's gone on. I mean, what's interesting is I'm a labor historian primarily, and North Carolina has it has had for many years one of the lowest rates of unionization in the country, although being one of the largest manufacturing population. But if you look at the history of resistance and efforts at organization in the state, it's probably as strong and powerful and dynamic as any place else in the country. We have, Gastonia, the story I write about in Winston-Salem, where thousands of Black workers organized one of the most anti-union companies in the companies in the country. And then just look at recently with the Moral Monday movement. I mean, nowhere else in the South did that just kind of spring up in response to the kind of conservative legislative agenda. I mean, it spread around to the rest of the South, but it had its roots here. And so I think there's something about this kind of contentiousness on the part of ordinary citizens in North Carolina that makes North Carolina a really important place for us to study.
Great, thank you for that. Speaking of a North Carolina thing, I know you both are very familiar with Terry Sanford's anti-poverty campaign. And I'm just curious about, in that campaign, were there echoes of the populist alliance of whites and Blacks that occurred in the 1890s? Or had racial animus taken over so much that this was could not be viewed as sort of a resurrection of a hopeful alliance between white allies and poor white allies and poor Blacks? Could you, how do those two eras speak to each other?
Yeah, I think Terry Sanford and the formation of the North Carolina Fund, just for folks who don't know that story, was a unique kind of public-private partnership of sorts. It was an anti-poverty initiative that Terry Sanford launched in 1963, funded initially by Ford Foundation money and money from the Z. Smith Reynolds and Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundations in North Carolina. I think Terry Sanford's thinking about poverty, when he created the North Carolina Fund, was very much informed by the kind of history we're talking about here. And the fund at its core, it did some of its most pioneering work in trying, and I'll underscore trying. It was difficult, and it finally fell victim to the kind of conservative turn of politics by 1968. But building these kinds of biracial alliances anew, particularly among Black and white people living in poverty in the state. Terry gave an extraordinary speech here in Chapel Hill in 1963 in early January to the North Carolina Press Association, and basically said, on this 100th anniversary of emancipation, we have to have a second emancipation, and we need to understand that we will never liberate, and this is back to a point we were talking about earlier, never liberate North Carolina, right, from poverty until we first liberate Black North Carolinians from Jim Crow. Now, another Southern governor gave a speech 4 days earlier, and everybody can probably guess who I'm thinking about, right? George Wallace being sworn in as governor of Alabama. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Two very different visions of the future of the South and of the United States, for that matter.
Thank you for that. Bob, any comments on?
No, I think that's a good.
Jim, all right, well, I wanted to say I'm very happy to see that we have some questions coming up down here in the question and answer session. I will just, I'll throw out one depressing question for you, one last one, based on what we saw on January 6th, what we've seen through the horrible persecution of people of color throughout the Jim Crow era. Can white supremacy be dismantled peacefully?
Well, I don't, at least in this point in time, I don't see any other way to do it. I think it's what's required, I think, is
let me rephrase that. Let me just say, like, can we do it in a way that doesn't encounter the violent backlash? And I'm not suggesting that, and that's really where the thrust of my question was.
Right. Well, I think there are a lot of I think there are a lot of things that have to be taken into consideration. I've been reading a great article by economic historian Gavin Wright, who looks at and he's looking at North Carolina and the South, and the kind of swing of white working class voters movement kind of into the Republican Party, if not into the Republican Party, at least voting for Republican candidates at much higher rate. And he really traces it back to the trade agreements of the Clinton era, and the kind of that Clinton and others were trying, that were putting forth, to trying to open up free trade around the world, and the kind of devastating impact that had on manufacturing workers in the South. Now, it had a terrible impact on African Americans and a growing number of Latinx workers, but it particularly affected workers in the textile industry and other large industries like that. And people were, their frustration was really was rooted in these kinds of changes that were taking place that made it very difficult for them to provide for their families, to support their local communities, and they were looking for answers somewhere else. So I think that there's a certain amount of education and kind of understanding the stuff that we're kind of doing. But there's also a need for really important public policies that tries to address the kind of broad needs for education, for opportunity, for good workplaces, for healthcare, that make people, turn to some of the more radical ideologies that are floating around today. So I think there's a lot of ways in which we need to be working on this issue and thinking about how we dismantle this kind of larger system of white supremacy.
Right.
And we're kind of at a pivotal moment in this country. I mean, I think everybody knows the Census Bureau predictions that sometime in the next, it's happened in terms of birth, but by 2040, maybe sooner, we become a minority country. And that's a very real challenge to what Du Bois called those wages of whiteness, both the real wages are the kinds that Bob's talking about, and the kind of psychological wages paid to people who were in those events on January the 6th, who are not people living on the margins, who are really driven by a kind of deep racial animus. I think education has a big role to play here. I know there are teachers watching. I'm sure folks are keeping up. Bob was getting me up to speed this morning about, efforts in the legislature to stop teaching. We're not going to mention white supremacy. That's divisive. Well, you're right, it's divisive. And it'll be even more so when, we don't address it. So I think we also have a real responsibility, not to indoctrinate, it's not what I'm talking about here, but really to educate, particularly to educate historically, the generations of North Carolinians who are going to be in charge of things in the future.
Great, and I do think these types of public programs are also incredibly important. So thank you for sharing this information with the world. I'm going to turn to some questions now, and I'm going to start with some questions that are more in a historical vein, and then go to maybe more contemporary ramifications. I'm going to see if I can combine two questions from our friend Niels Brubaker, who asked a very pointed one: what was the anti-single shot changed by was the anti-single shot changed by the legislature challenged in court as being unconstitutional? When and how was it overturned? And then in addition to that, besides the literary test amendment, what other state laws were used to subjugate blacks in North Carolina? So first on the single shot little details, and then look at some of the other laws.
Anti-single shot law, that's a simple one. It was overturned by the federal courts in 1972 in the case of Dunstan v. Scott from North Carolina.
And could you name some of the other laws, beside the Literary Test Amendment of 1900, what other state laws were used to subjugate blacks in North Carolina in the years before
Well,
federal civil war?
we initially had a poll tax in North Carolina, but that was taken off the books fairly early in the process. I mean, the literacy clause was, in terms of politics, was the most important one, and we didn't have a white primary in this state. It was the local Democratic Party and the registrars did a really good job in not trying to keep people from voting. I think, one other thing is the way in which kind of the culture of segregation, and there are actually very, very few actual laws that prohibited, that supported segregation, in a kind of formal way. A lot of it was cultural, and one of the things that did that I think was really important is that it kind of kept black and whites from interacting with each other in whether it's in social or civic or private spaces, cultural spaces, religious spaces, and stuff. In the workplace, in particular, in ways that they would have been able to build relationships and build common understandings about stuff. I mean, that was what was so devastating for white elites at the end of the 19th century. It was these coalitions, the fact that people were getting together. So I think that if we're looking at the legal structure, it's important to do that in terms of voting law and maybe some segregation laws. But I think it's the cultural context of Jim Crow was also, in a kind of ideological context that I think is also important.
Great, thank you.
One other sort of characteristic of elections, so a matter of law that lingers in this state and other southern states, is the requirement that in primaries you can't win without a majority.
Right.
All right, which you may have gotten a 49% plurality, but then you're forced into a runoff. And if you're the minority candidate, right? I mean, again, the math. If you had two white opponents and you combine your votes, right? The bet is behind that requirement that one of those one of those candidates in the runoff will prevail.
Thank you for that. We know now just how damaging to our polity partisan identity and partisanship is. And Betty James asked a question: at what point did Democrats and Republicans reverse roles, or do you think they have? That might be a relatively short question to answer, but could you also speak a little bit about how partisan identity is maybe occluding some of these or complicating the issue of reforming these problems?
Yeah, well, I think the short answer to the first part is that flip really begins in a major way in the 1930s, all right, and in the ways that FDR begins to reposition the New Deal as how to describe it, a kind of on again, off again friend of civil rights. But what that does, and that strategic change. So the other thing that's happened is during the Great Migration during World War I in the 20s, millions of blacks left the South and went to the major urban centers of the industrial Northeast and Midwest, and there they could vote. They didn't escape to segregation. I mean, that was still there, but they could vote, and they began to use those votes, particularly within democratic city governments. So what's happening by the 30s is that the National Democratic Party is an alliance of liberal middle class voters, organized labor, and this growing population of African American voters outside the South. And it has this weird inconsistency in it, and that is all those Southern Democrats who are white supremacists. And that tension just intensifies over the years until it really blows the party apart during and after the civil rights movement of the 1960s. You just can't hold that thing together. And by the 60s, the Republican Party is beginning to embrace a Southern strategy. That is, we can win if we'll appeal to white voters who feel like they've been abandoned by the Democratic Party. And so that there is this flip. And in North Carolina, I guess it is sort of firmly in place in the 1972 election, right? Jim Holshouser, the first Republican governor since the 1890s, and Jesse Helms, first elected to the Senate.
Great, thank you for that. And just in terms of that second part of that question was actually mine, but partisan identity really seems that there, has become so strong that these issues become Republican and Democrat issues and not issues of racial justice writ large. Is that really problematic? The partisan hardening lines in figuring out how to get beyond this and find common ground?
I think those are representatives of different perspectives and different worldviews, I think, about what democracy looks like, what the role of public policy plays, what the role of government, what kind of government we have and how expansive that is. I mean, I think that, we can put labels on it, political parties. That's the way people organize themselves around things. But I think what's really most important, and we're trying to do that in this book, is to try to look at, regardless of party identification, the kind of social, political, economic perspectives and the trade-offs and the differences between those, and how contests over what democracy looked like has been at the core of this battle that we're trying to talk about, from at least the end of the Civil War to the present. And it's right there, as Jim says, if you read, in the 1868 Constitution and the kind of public policies that are being put forward by newly enfranchised men. So I think we need to be looking on those terms, looking at those kind of worldviews and not so much about party labels, although those are, useful, I guess.
Thank you for that.
The other thing that's happened here is that, the parties themselves have become profoundly racially polarized. I'm sorry, I was kind of flipping through here trying to find the number so that I don't misspeak. But if you look at the Republican Party today, it is overwhelmingly white. All right. I'm kind of trying not. I guess we've already slipped into politics. I should give up trying to, not to do that. But I mean, that's a statement of fact. It's become overwhelmingly white. So these racial politics, that's the way in which partisanship becomes, in the current moment, an accurate representation.
Well, if you want to avoid politics, I'm afraid we have some upcoming questions that'll test us a little bit. I want to just combine. James Evans and Rob David are both interested in knowing about the past, present, and future of gerrymandering in North Carolina. So if you could speak a little bit about what role it played in the past, and what is the status of our maps now, and what can we expect?
Well, since Republicans want to, just to go back and kind of recount the history a little bit, in 2010, and largely riding the Tea Party movement, gained for the first time in a century a majority in both the Senate and the House, in the state legislature, and that was 2010. That's a decennial census year, and so it fell to them to redraw legislative district maps in North Carolina. They did that in a way that produced a supermajority in 2012, and then used that supermajority to frame House Bill 589. So I think, as people know, there've been successful court rulings, both in terms of congressional districts, but also in terms of legislative districts, to try to put some limits on gerrymandering. I think what people should know is that both parties are guilty of gerrymandering, and it's been done for a long, long time. But what's different now is that we have largely the technology, particularly the data sets and the computational power, to draw lines with remarkable precision. I mean, this is a little bit of an overstatement, but not much. The ability to come through your neighborhood and my neighborhood and separate, me from the person who two doors down votes the other way. I think that what that really ought to make clear is to people is, no matter what their party affiliation might be, this isn't good for democracy. And we just have to find a better way.
Great.
Of districting.
Well, our colleague, Lloyd Kramer, is going to push you to some contemporary politics by asking, people say that North Carolina could soon vote like Virginia and Georgia voted in 2020, but do you think a fear of this prospect will now lead to new voter suppression strategies in the NC legislature? Thank you for that question, Lloyd.
Yes.
Well, I would imagine it's happening all over the rest of the South, so I can't imagine it won't happen here. I mean, in North Carolina's case, at least, conservatives don't have a supermajority, and the Democratic governor can veto any kind of real new voter suppression laws that might come into place. But I think a lot of this depends on the kind of the mobilization of people in North Carolina. We've got another election coming up in a couple years. There are a lot of court cases out there. There's a lot of public opinion still to be influenced, and I think that one of the big challenges ahead is can there be enough energy put into not just focusing on the year, every election every 4 years or every 2 years, but into the kind of education and mobilization and organization that's going to be necessary to engage more and more people in the electoral process. And that ultimately, I think, is what the key to having a robust democracy is all about. It's not less democracy. And Jim and I've been talking about this a lot and thinking about it. What we need now is more democracy, not less democracy.
Great, thank you for that. We have some challenging questions here. Catherine Kuykendall, Kathy, maybe perhaps the Kuykendalls together asked this question. If the Republican majority in the NC legislature heard this talk, would they endanger your jobs at UNC? I guess that only counts for you and me, Jim. Bob being at Duke has the grace of a private institution protecting him. But the real question, I think, is, do legislatures acknowledge the underlying object of these NC laws, both laws in the past and the current potential new laws? And I really like that the angle of that question is, how much of this history is known by our legislatures as they enact these new reforms, and are they at all cognizant of the actions of the past?
Well, that's a big set of questions. I don't know what's happened to my image here. The sun's coming the wrong time of day.
A little ghostly, James.
Yeah. That's not going to help much, I don't think. It's just the time of day, I'm afraid. I'm going to see if I can't do my camera a little differently.
Well, it's
maybe.
That's good.
It's kind of a little bit of like a ghost.
There we go. That's a little better. What I'd say is that I actually find most people I talk to about these things, open to a conversation. I think a lot of this history isn't isn't well known. And I don't know, I just always try to think about, you know, aiming at the big group of people in between who may not know much of this history, and you know, who are open to a frank conversation, and to sort of being educated in both directions. So not trying just to preach to the people I know's heads will nod and say yes, and maybe not preaching so much to the people I know whose heads are going to do this before we ever get started. But I do think, and you know, and especially some of the points that Bob has made, there is possibility and hope here. But we've got to be doing this work again, as Bob said, you know, all along. It's not just about knocking on doors ahead of the November election, but it's about knocking on doors and educating and talking through these issues 365 days a year.
Great, thank you for that. Cindy Madden, I asked, I'm going to change it from the way Republicans just say, because we clearly have seen that, you know, the party labels have changed. Let me just put it frankly, the way those who support a system of white supremacy have been able to turn impoverished people against each other based on race amazes me. How has this been so successful to convince people to vote against their own best interest?
Well, folks might start by buying a copy of Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom on Virginia in the late 16th and 17th centuries, and you know, he'll help you understand a lot of this. And I can dive into that if we have a little bit of time, but I won't right now. But look, I mean, Morgan's point is that American slavery and American freedom were born together, and they've been connected ever since. You know, there's a long history in this country of whites. You know, the notion that white people are, their freedom is directly connected to the subjugation and dependent upon the subjugation of black people, whether that's in slavery or in Jim Crow. So, you know, if we're talking about these issues today, you know, go point to some of the things Bob, you know, was talking about. If we talk about the ways in which people, you know, find themselves marginalized politically and economically, well, we can have a 3-hour seminar on economics and politics and public policy. Or I can just look at you and say, well, I know what the problem is. Those people did it. Yeah. Right? Black and brown people did it. And in a country where race has been so central, I mean, you right? I mean, that's there, it's ready, you just touch it, and there we go. That's what we're struggling against. Indeed. And it's why we've got to talk about white supremacy, you know, in the public school curriculum.
Yeah, I was struck. I was when I was looking at preparing this work, and you showed that the ribbon with the white supremacy on it. One of the things that's just clear about this is that too often we know that President Biden used this term in his inauguration, and too often those who get rankled by the term think it's something that was created by hippies and anti-racists to make white people feel uncomfortable. But that is just clearly explicit in that ribbon, that this was not hidden, that this was the goal. And I think that's really important to shine light on that and make us realize why this is being discussed in 2021 to this day. We have, do we have any? It looks like we might have one more question that's just coming up, but thank you, Cindy, you're more than welcome. So thank you for asking the question. And, you know, those are difficult questions for sure. And ones that I know Jim says we could probably go on and talk for hours about the history of that in the United States. I would just like to end, if I could, if you'll indulge me with one last question. I'm really struck by the relationship between the federal government and the state governments in all this. And I think the story of the civil rights movement has often been that there are states who are enacting repressive laws. And then since the civil rights era, the federal government is stepping in, and of course with court cases and whatnot. Can states and should states be the engines of change in this, and must it start at the state level and sort of stop waiting for the federal government to come in and save the day, if you will? What is the role of states in this? And I'm thinking of the North Carolina Constitution of 1868 was a hopeful document. Can you speak a little bit about where the states will go in the future in helping to bring about this reform?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, I think that, I'll just start with and let Jim chime in. Um, I think the states I think there's a lot of possibility and potential in states being able to play a larger role. And we're seeing this like in Georgia, and we've seen it in some other southern states where, as more and as fewer restrictions on voting, as more people become engaged in politics and see it's, in their interest to get out and vote and to get their neighbors to vote and to participate in a lot of different ways. Um, I think there's a lot of potential at that level, but there's also, there's a lot of, there are a lot of states around the country and, who have enormous power in Washington, that they wouldn't have if we didn't have the kind of system and the structure, whether it's the electoral college or the representation in the Senate. Both of those things make us so far from a real, a democratic system where one person, his vote counts the same as everybody else's. That's just not true. So I think there's a lot of potential, but there needs to be also a lot of reform in the relationship between states and the federal government too.
I think one of the themes, in the history we're living through right now is just a reminder that states control the way elections are conducted. And so there's lots of possibility there. Imagine if, lawmakers in North Carolina said, all right, what we're going to do is dedicate ourselves in this next session to investigating and enacting law focused on maximizing the opportunities for every citizen in North Carolina to participate in the political process. That ought to be a non-controversial, non-partisan objective in a democratic society, right? And what's interesting, is you can go into the past and as I suggested earlier, find things you would never imagine. Here's an idea. It's back to the election law of 1898, which that Fusion Alliance passed. That law required employers not to penalize workers who took time off from their jobs to go vote. Imagine that, right? If every employer in the state of North Carolina had to make it possible without penalty for every one of their employees to exercise that fundamental democratic right and responsibility. That same law, by the way, in 1895, also required campaign finance reporting. So there are, I think a lot, and we could go on, but I think just lots of ways that if we wanted to, this state could show great leadership in, dedicating, as Bob said earlier, its energy not to less, but to more democracy, and to making sure that, as I said, every North Carolinian has, as the Constitution guarantees, the right to cast a ballot in a free and fair election.
Great, thank you for that. And I want to thank both of you, Jim Leloudis, Bob Korstad. I want to thank you both for your service as historians, but also for your service in the name of democracy. I think it's incredibly important that this history be shared. We at Carolina Public Humanities will continue to do our part with the Carolina K-12. Parting words you'd like to share with our audience, gentlemen?
Well, one pitch, and not so much to sell books, though. It'd be wonderful if people
well,
buy a
look
book.
in our chat. We've got your books there. So.
Okay, great. But if you really want to encourage people to go to the website, fragiledemocracy.com, to have a look at, we've created a digital exhibit that goes along with the book. And I know we've heard from a number of people that they've used it in their classrooms as a teaching tool and so on. So we'd love people to go take a look at that, and feel free to share the link with anyone and everyone you know who might be interested. And I think especially for folks who may not have the time to sit down and read a book, though this is a relatively short book. You know, it's a chance to spend a half an hour with some really quite remarkable images to learn some of this history.
It really is wonderful. Help me prepare for this discussion, in fact. So thank you, Bob.
Okay, thank y'all.
Words?
Just thanks very much, and thanks for all the great work y'all do. It's always a pleasure to be involved.
All right. Well, it's great to see you both in this virtual world. Hopefully next time we do something together, it'll be in 3 dimensions.
Yep.
But one more time, thank you, Bob Korstad from Duke and Jim Leloudis from UNC. And thank you all for coming to Carolina Public Humanities. Go to humanities.unc.edu to check out our other offerings, Adventures and Ideas, other Humanities in Actions talks, and of course, Lunch with Friends and Strangers. And please check us out on Facebook and all of those social media things that people rattle off all the time. So, all right, thank you, everyone. This has been wonderful, a real pleasure. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye-bye now.